An event, seen from one point of view, gives one impression. Seen from another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
What initially appeared to be this man perhaps trying to escape from something, to this man appearing to being in an attack mode, to actually ending up being some sort of a good Samaritan trying to actually protect this other individual from being hurt. Okay. So what's the point of this? Perspective. Point of view, absolutely. Okay. So, and here you could say even, to some degree, it's the camera angle. And I have to say, some of my clients who perhaps have come frequently, typically I don't sit directly, face to face, but just on a little bit of an angle. But what I'm seeing is that person's face. And sometimes it's really kind of an odd experience if they would turn to look at something else. Seeing their profile kind of looks different. Okay? So it's just a slight change in perspective, but things can look different. So let me turn your attention to the first question here. So my theme of movies would be, I think sometimes it's reasonable to think about each of our own lives as a movie. So, in your movie, for each of you, right now, one of the central themes, hopefully, is being here at this session, right? The question is, what's your role in other people's movie in this room? And my guess is most of you picked item C. Okay. So, however, because what I'm familiar with is my movie and my storyline, my automatic tendency, even though I know better rationally, but my automatic tendency is to sort of assume that everybody else is experiencing the same movie, when indeed they aren't. Or at least my tendency is to assume, because I'm the star in my movie, is to assume that other people are at least in my movie. I'm aware of you being here. Okay? And so it's easy for me to assume that, again, you're having some focus on me. Now, it's probably safe for me to assume that in your movies there's some attention on me. But if I were a participant, let's say I were just a participant and I came in late right now, in your movies you might notice that I walked in late, or you might not even be aware. If I'm got your attention enough, you might not even be aware that I'm walking in and sitting down. So in my movie, I'm the actor, I'm the star. But other people, with regard to my movie, at best are observers. Okay? And we experience life very differently if we're the actor versus being the observer. Okay? And in that brief video clip I showed you, okay, observers of that, depending on their perspective, are going to have a very different storyline. What's this guy running from? Oh no, this guy's going to attack this other man. Oh wow, did you see? He saved him from getting crushed by all that stuff. And so sometimes I think people assume that we have a bigger role in other people's movie than we actually do. Or in relationships, what our focus is going to be tonight, that can make us prone to doing some mind reading. In other words, if I'm thinking that somebody else is experiencing my story, my movie, then I can assume something about what they're thinking based on my experience, failing to recognize that in their movie, I may not even have a role, or what they're experiencing may be very different from mine. Does that make sense? Questions about that?
President Trump.
Say more. President Trump.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the way, everybody perceives him the way you think you're supposed to perceive. And who knows what he really means.
Okay. And you're making reference to Donald Trump. We could make that same statement probably about anybody in public life. That we're making some inferences about, we'll continue with him for a moment, what he really believes or what he really means or what he's really intending to do. So he's got a role in our movies, and each of us is making some interpretation of that. None of us really know what it's like in his own movie. And early on in his campaign, I'll tell you one of my theories in my own movie was, I'm not sure he really wants to get the nomination. I think he's just testing to see how far he can go before it collapses. And it never did. Again, so that could be my interpretation, but here he is, nominee for president. So in terms of perspective, I think it's very important to keep in mind that nobody else's perspective is identical to mine. Who knows what I mean by the game of telephone? We could play that here, so I could tell you a brief story, and you whisper it to everybody. By the time it got to the back, there's going to be a different... And so each time a person is telling the story, there's some of their own interpretation and meaning that tends to get infused. Let's go to question number 2. When having a conversation with another person, which is most true for you? That you're partially listening to what the other person is saying, but mostly thinking about what you're going to say next, or listening so carefully to what the other person is saying that before you can say anything, you have to pause, because only then are you thinking about what you want to respond, or missing a lot of what they're saying because your mind's already elsewhere.
Perspective from a spouse or unit or a friend unit.
Okay? And in probably different situations, it's going to be different. Okay? Now, if you've got a significant other, think about your relationship. Or, let's say you're debating. Okay? Let's say we're having a political debate. Okay? How likely is it that I'm truly listening to what you're saying versus thinking about how I'm going to respond, particularly if we are coming from the different perspectives? I would argue that listening is a lost art. Because truly, if we listen, when there's a conversation going, there ought to be a pause. As it is, though, there's rarely a pause. And what's even more likely is that one person is trying to jump in and almost talk on top of the other. As I think you know, a big part of my job is training physicians. And so one of the things we'll talk about is listening skills. It's part of my job. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but there have been studies about how long physicians let their patient talk about what brings them into the office before they interrupt. And at least one prominent study that gets cited a lot is 18 seconds. And then it's also well established that physicians underestimate how much time they talk and overestimate how much time they let the patient talk. Okay? And by no means am I here to bash physicians, because I'm guessing we could find similar patterns in other professional settings. But what I'm teaching them often is, okay, with this information, we look at the benefits of letting your patient talk more. Chances are they might tell you something that's going to be pretty relevant. One of the things we talk about is one of the chief complaints that patients have about their doctors is their doctors don't listen. What do you suppose one of the chief complaints on the part of physicians is about their patients? They don't listen. So, we've kind of begun to get at this first point. What's it mean to listen well? To some degree, I would answer that question by saying it means being able to then take what that person has said and actually repeat it in a fairly accurate manner. I think I mentioned last time, in fact, that can be a good strategy when there's an argument, to switch positions and try to argue the other person's point of view, because that then truly involves or requires understanding what the other person's point of view actually is. So why is this so important for relationships? Why does it matter?
The only way to really know what the other person's relationship needs or wants from the relationship.
Yeah. Relationships, one metaphor that we can use is kind of like a dance. You know, if you're trying to dance with somebody but not paying really any attention to them, probably wouldn't look very smooth. You wouldn't win Dancing with the Stars. So yes, and a lot of times if relationships are in trouble, one of the things that first comes to their mind is we have problems with communication. And in many cases, that indeed is true. I'm not sure that communication is always the answer, but often there are problems in communication. What I mean here by reciprocity is that sometimes relationships get imbalanced, that one person is doing a lot of the talking, and sometimes the one who's doing a lot of the talking, sort of by definition, isn't doing a lot of listening. Okay? And often when there's, and that's not to say that in a good relationship people talk an equal amount. I'm not implying that. Some of us are more talkative than others. But nonetheless, reciprocity in terms of willingness to truly listen to the other and understand what they're saying is what I mean here.
It's a defense mechanism they don't want to understand.
Sometimes it is. Sometimes people talk about how men tend to lose their hearing right in the frequency range of their wives' voices. How convenient. So yes, there are some times I think where there's probably more intent to not listen than is maybe aware. It may not completely be at the person's awareness. So, how do we listen better? And I'm going to draw here from some of what I try to teach physicians. How would you define an open-ended question?
Any question that can be answered with a simple yes or no.
Perfect. And a closed question is one that can be answered with yes or no. Okay? And one example I'll use with physicians is, okay, if you ask your patient this question, is it a closed or an open question? Can you tell me a little bit about how you're sleeping? Is that open or closed? Because?
They can say, yes, I can tell you, or no, I can't tell you.
Right. So it sounds like an open question. It sounds like an invitation, but truly that's a closed question. Okay. Now, one of the things I'll say is, what's the point of can you tell me? Just get to, how are you sleeping? which is truly an open-ended question. Okay? Now, the point of an open-ended question is I want to hear more than yes or no. So if I truly want to listen, then I should be asking open-ended questions. So if I go home tonight and say to my wife, "Did you have a good day?" That's a question calling for a yes or no. Where if I say, "How was your day?" she might give me a brief answer, fine. But how was your day is an open question, right? Grammatically, it's inviting more. And if she says fine, if I truly want to listen, I'll say, well, tell me more what your day was like. Tell me what you did. One of my pet peeves is listening to the radio or watching television when somebody's being interviewed and the interviewer asks closed questions. And what especially gets me upset is when the interviewer offers their opinion and then asks the interviewee, "Is that right?" I don't want to hear the opinion of the interviewer. I want to hear what the person being interviewed has to say. So I sometimes I'll say, "Where in the world did that journalist go to school? And don't they know how to teach these folks open-ended questions?" Okay. So I'm sure the residents on our residency program get tired of me talking about open-ended questions, but most inquiries that we ask in a closed fashion can be done in an open-ended way. And I think if we truly want to listen and understand, then it behooves us to ask open questions. This sort of thing's also been studied in the workplace. And the 3-to-1 ratio actually has come under some criticism because of the mathematics the investigators used, but it looks still like this is an appropriate range in the workplace for teams to do well. And interestingly, when it's studied, there seems to be a pretty big difference between 2-to-1 and 3-to-1. That even moving from 2-to-1 to 3-to-1 can make a big difference. Now, having said that, it's not that we should not have a 0 in the negative column. That's probably just not like life. Right? You know, when we were talking about negative emotions last week, I wasn't up here saying we should never experience negative emotions. We should never get angry. Anger's part of life. Okay.
And how would we achieve this? I mean, we're all kind of, we do whatever it is we do, and if it's the wrong way, it's hard to change that behavior. So what, maybe getting to that when we're...
Well, I think that's a great question. How can we do this? Let me first... Let me first of all respond to your question with something that we might be talking about a little more in another session, but I'll mention it now, and that is we're creatures of habit. I would argue that most of our behavior is automatic. Okay. And it's automatic based on cues in the environment. Okay. If you ask me right now what my logon code is and my password to get on my computer first thing in the morning, I'd probably have to work right now to come up with it. But when I walk into my office first thing in the morning, I don't even have to think about it. I sit down and... because that's a cue for that information to be right there. Okay. Or I don't have to make a decision to brush my teeth tonight. When I do my before-bed routine, I'll automatically brush my teeth. Okay. And in relationships, we develop habits as well. So, and I would be very upfront and say, I think behavior change is hard. And so, in relationships, we get into patterns of relating. And so if you've got a relationship where your pattern, let's say it's 3-to-1, it's going to take some work to move it up to 5-to-1. What I like to say about behavior change is the first step in behavior change is awareness. that if I'm not aware of anything needing to change, then there's not going to be any change. So I think the first step is awareness, and then following that with some intent, some plan to actually make a change. Okay? So, and usually that has, you like to do that in real time, but especially with changing habits, I think it takes some planning upstream. So in a relationship with a spouse, for example, I think to change that ratio probably is going to involve some, intentional thought about where are there opportunities for me to respond in a more positive way. So that when I'm in this situation, instead of doing X, I'm going to do Y. So having a clear intent, clear plan. Or next time I'm upset about this, instead of doing my usual sigh of exasperation, maybe I'm going to do nothing. So I'm going to at least eliminate that negative. But I think you make an excellent point that it's not as easy as walking out of here tonight and saying, okay, I'm going to bump up that positive number. It takes some work because we are such creatures of habit.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Joyce, are you familiar with Joyce Meyer?
I can't say I'm real familiar. I may have.
She has this book. It's called Making Bad Habits Making Good Habits, Breaking Bad Habits.
Uh-huh.
So, and her philosophy is you don't think about it, you just do it. So it's like, if you're trying to stop drinking soda, you don't think about it, you just don't do it. It's not a process of thinking.
I would.
Change those bad habits.
Yeah, I would agree with that if indeed, the way to not drink a soda, in my opinion, if you have a habit of drinking soda, would be for it to not be available to you. So in other words, if I have a habit of drinking a soda,
Don't put it in the fridge.
absolutely. Or if I don't want to be drinking a soda when I'm working at my desk and I've got a soda there, I would suggest that I'm probably going to drink it if I don't think about not drinking it. And its very presence is going to cue me to drink it. Now, if it's not there, then I would agree that then I don't have to think about it. And to that point, I think often when we think about changing behaviors, we think about what do I need to do to change my behavior, when sometimes a better question is, what do I need to change in my environment so that my environment cues different behavior?
Do you think if you think about it too long, you're just not going to do it?
Well,
I know when people, I've heard of people, thinking too much about things, about change, and they just think about it too much and it never happens.
I'd probably be more inclined to suggest that there's something about their thinking that's probably
Not getting
sustaining the behavior rather than changing the behavior. That makes sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I just didn't want to say I know, but I wanted to say I've heard.
Yeah, and there are certainly different opinions on exactly what it takes to change behavior. I do think where there's certainly some common ground in these perspectives is if we change the cues, then there's a good likelihood that behavior will change. An example of changing cues is, I don't know the specific numbers here, but a year or two ago, Governor Kasich here in Ohio, in his budget proposal, he had proposed an increase in tax on cigarettes that was fairly significant, to the extent that those that do actuarial data could say with pretty good reliability how many percentage points that would drop the smoking rate in Ohio. And that could be done based on data from other jurisdictions and so forth. Okay. And then the budget that the legislature passed actually had a much smaller increase in tax. So I'm not sure if the increase was enough to actually affect the smoking rate. Now, my point is, changing the rate of tax on cigarettes isn't directly, it's not like something magical is going into a smoker's mind to change thoughts about smoking. But the cue of how much I have to pay for my pack of cigarettes is changing, and there's evidence that that will change behavior. Perhaps you can remember what happened in New York City when, I think it was Mayor Bloomberg maybe, who proposed a ban on supersized soft drinks. And part of the idea was, let's just remove them from the environment. Okay. That never happened. There was such an outcry. But my point is that would be an example. If we want to reduce how much soft drinks people are drinking, one of the ways is to just remove it. Any other comments about some of this? Let's move on. The term capitalization is used in a lot of different forms. One of the things we learned in grade school was capitalizing letters, right? Going from lowercase to uppercase. So that's one use of the term. Another is more economic. You're converting resources into accumulation, building capital. Another is taking advantage of opportunities, capitalizing on an opportunity. What I want to talk about tonight is this term's been used on the process of sharing good news and responding to good news in relationships. So first of all, let's talk about what happens when I share good news. The capitalization that occurs for me is when I tell somebody else about something good that's happened to me, I get to re-experience it. It may not be like the actual thing, but there is some re-experiencing that occurs. So if indeed it was a good thing, I get to experience it again. Mm-hmm.
I don't remember where I saw this, but apparently if you haven't actually achieved something, but you set this goal for yourself, or you're really excited about something new that you're going to make this change, if you tell people about it, and you kind of get that experience, that high of I'm doing this, and you've already got their positive regard for doing it, then you're much less likely to actually go through with it and do it.
Because you don't need to do it.
Exactly, you've already gotten the buzz from it, so to speak. So
Yeah.
it's better to wait to actually achieve the goal before sharing it with people.
Yeah. I can think of this would probably take us into too much of a different road tonight, but another way of looking at that I think often we put too much emphasis on the destination and not enough on the journey, when a lot of the growth and benefit actually comes from the process of trying to achieve something. So in a case like that, if I had said, this is what I'm going to do, or almost acted as if I've done it when I really haven't, I may get some boost from that, but probably not as deep of a boost or as strong of a boost as if I actually had invested the time and energy into doing it. So here in terms of sharing good news, I get to experience it again. So more positive emotion. And each time I do that, there is, again, some re-experiencing. Let's say it's a funny story. Each time I tell it, I get to laugh again. Feels good to laugh. And then, in terms of memory, each time I tell it, I'm further solidifying it in my memory. So in terms of building capital in my memory, each time I tell it, it's increasing. Yes?
Would that only be if you get a positive response? So if you got a negative response from doing this, wouldn't it do the opposite for you probably?
Good point. You're anticipating where I'm going. Okay. And I would suggest that depending on the response, doesn't necessarily wipe this completely out, but certainly can have an impact on it. Sometimes it's hard for me to remember exactly what I've talked about where, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself. But one of the ways to think about memories is that it's like a library in our minds. And one of the important ways in which memories are organized is by emotion. I think I might have mentioned this with regard to anger. So if I'm angry now, So I've got an anger section in my library, I've got a happy section in my library, I've got a worried section in my library. Okay. And so what I'm talking about here is each time I tell about a good experience, it's sort of making that a bigger book in that library, if you will, so it's more available. Interestingly, my emotional state now sort of puts me in that place in my memory library. So if I'm angry right now, it's sort of like in my library, I'm in the anger section, so it's a whole lot easier for me at that point to reach out all these other memories of things that make me angry, which is why in arguments, when somebody's upset, they often do the kitchen sinking we talked about last week. Not only am I mad at you about this today, but 2 weeks ago you did that. And okay, if I'm had something good that happened to me today, let's say this morning, and then I tell somebody this afternoon, when I tell them, the very process of telling them is not only making that book bigger in my library, the good experience of telling them is putting me in that part of my library. And if I'm around these positive books, that's going to help support my mood. Okay. So again, I think this is where some of this term capitalization comes from. It's building this resource, so it's enhancing sort of my overall state. So let's get to the responding part. And from a relationship standpoint, this is probably more important. The work, to give credit, is an investigator at UCLA, Shelley Gable, who's done this research. So the way she's studied how folks respond to good news is on really 2 dimensions, which comes up with 4 categories. Is the response to the sharing of good news passive or active? And is it constructive or destructive? Okay. So let's look at examples of each. So a passive, destructive response to somebody sharing good news with you would basically being almost just no response. So what? So little eye contact, disinterested, maybe even turning away, commenting about something completely different. Okay? So it's passive. There's not any direct thing that's trying to be destructive of what's being told, but it's destructive in that there's no real reception of it. Okay? Active destructive, which unfortunately I think happens a lot, is finding the downsides of the good news. Okay. So your kid comes home from school and opens the mail and sees that she's been accepted to Harvard. And she's excited. I got in. And you as parents say, oh gosh, we're not going to be able to afford this. Okay. Or now you're really going to have to work hard because, every kid that gets into Harvard is as smart as, if not smarter than you. Okay. So here she is, all excited, and you're the wet blanket. Okay. So that's what's meant by an active, destructive response to sharing of good news. A passive, constructive response to good news is saying something positive, but with relatively little enthusiasm. Okay? So, well, that's nice. And my animated icon here, I don't think continues, so pay attention here. When it goes forward, there we go. It used to jump up and down. I don't know what happened to it. So, an active, constructive response to sharing of good news. That's great. Tell me more. So what does that do? It allows the person telling who has experienced a good thing to really re-experience it, because now I've got an audience who really wants to hear about it. Okay? And with this kind of a response to the good news, truly the recipient gets to share in it as well. Whereas if it's a destructive response or a passive constructive response, then the recipient really is not getting to experience that good thing. So, and notice up here the open-ended questions. Ask encouraging open-ended questions. Tell me more about what that was like. So what are the implications of this? Well, again, it sort of amplifies that good experience, and it's giving that relationship a positive interaction, so it's a way to build the 5-to-1. Interestingly, in some of Shelley Gable's research, having an active, constructive response to the sharing of good news was a stronger predictor of whether or not these relationships would continue than was how these couples handled conflict. And I say that because handling conflict is often thought to be a pretty good predictor of how relationships are going to do going into the future. So again, this was a stronger predictor of these relationships continuing. In at least the best known study here, these were dating couples, so they looked at how long the relationship continued. So in terms of the question about how to build this would be one specific example: is how does good news get shared in important relationships in your life? In sharing it. Now, if you get a destructive response, then that's going to be disincentive for you to share in that relationship. And I do think sometimes couples probably develop habits where good news doesn't get shared because the typical response is either passive or destructive. So this could be something where, there could be an intention to say, let's do more about sharing good things, and let's respond in an active, constructive way. Comments or questions about capitalization? Let's go to question number 3. Which of the following statements is most accurate? Who wants to volunteer what they think is the correct answer? B, good relationships benefit health more than bad relationships harm health. Sounded safe. What else did I hear? C, that bad relationships harm health more than good relationships benefit health. Okay. So let's proceed here. Actually, the effect of bad relationships in terms of harming health is stronger than is the benefit that comes from good relationships. So indeed, there is a benefit from good relationships, but that benefit doesn't carry as much weight as does the harmful effects on health of bad relationships. And interestingly, the research would be pretty clear that the way having good relationships in our lives most benefits our health, I mean, there are other benefits from good relationships, but in terms of our health, seems to be the role they play when we're stressed. And in part, the reason for this is how harmful stress is on our bodies. Let me just mention a little bit about stress and its effect on our bodies. One of the important parts of the way our bodies work is our immune systems. So our immune systems help protect us from pathogens, be it bacteria, viruses, and so forth. Being a caregiver for an Alzheimer's patient would be an example of chronic stress. It's 24/7. And it's stressful for lots of reasons. We won't have to get into all of that. But one of the things that's known about caregivers in these kind of situations is they tend to be sicker. If they get wounded, wounds take longer to heal. When they get immunizations, and if you understand how immunizations work, your body's given basically a threat, and it develops antibodies, so it's prepared to deal with that threat when it actually occurs. Okay? So folks have a poorer response to immunizations. Interestingly, this happens on an acute basis as well. I know this research has been done at OSU. They've taken medical students, and I had to pay them, of course, to do this. But what they did was give them a standardized wound, and that they used a punch biopsy on their upper palate, so they created a standardized wound. Okay? And then what they would do is follow the wound healing. How long did it take for that wound to heal? During exam periods, more stressful times, it took longer for the wounds to heal than during other periods during the quarter when it wasn't so stressful. And indeed, even with medical students, typically they're relatively healthy. They too, during stressful periods, had poorer response to immunizations. On our genes, there's a component referred to or labeled a telomere. One of the things we know is that telomeres get shorter as we get older. The more inflammation in our bodies, the shorter telomeres get. There's evidence now that stress, chronic stress, tends to shorten telomeres. So to say that stress affects our genes actually is true. So my point is there's a whole lot of research out there about the harmful effects of stress on health. So one of the benefits of having good relationships in our lives is that it helps buffer the negative effects of stress. Bad relationships harm health largely because that it in and of itself is a significant stressor. So not only are you then taking away a potential buffer, protectant from stress, that relationship is becoming another source of stress. Yes?
It could be looked at like a chronic disorder. Think of it that way.
Absolutely. A bad relationship is like having a chronic illness. Yeah, excellent way of looking at it. So I want to talk a little bit about how some of this works. One of the things that's been studied a lot in terms of relationships and health is what's referred to as social support. And we often don't necessarily think about social support in intimate relationships, but I think the basic principles can apply here. When we think about social support, usually we're thinking about this first category. People who are sort of there for us emotionally. You know, will cheer us up, people we can cry on their shoulder, commiserate with, go to the bar with to whine about the boss or whatever it is. Okay, that would be emotional social support. A second category is instrumental social support. This would be doing things to help somebody. Okay. So my son's moving into an apartment. Okay, finding some people to help him move would be obtaining instrumental support. Informational support would be resources, those people to whom you would look to for advice or guidance or information, their knowledge. Now, what I think is important about this is looking at these different categories. Most of us in our relationships are not equally good at all three of them. And one of the things that can trouble relationships sometimes is that one party is looking for a certain kind of support, and that may not be a strength of that other person. I remember a patient years ago who came to me shortly after being diagnosed with breast cancer and wanted to work with me as she was going through the journey that she had to go through. And interestingly, she would talk at times about how her husband was doing a lot more things around the house with household things and doing more things to take care of the kids. But if she wanted to talk about what she was going through or how she was feeling, it's like he wasn't there for her. But she did talk about some of the friends she had with whom she could talk about how she was feeling, what she was afraid of. Okay? And so one of the things we did was look at different kinds of support. And instead of lamenting that she wasn't necessarily getting emotional support from her husband, to perhaps celebrate that she was getting some significant instrumental support from him. And that indeed in her circle of friends and relationships, that her friends appeared to be a better source of emotional support for her than did her husband. Now that's not to say that we shouldn't be able to get emotional support from the people that we're closest to. Ideally we can. But some of us are better at other kinds of support. And you can probably think in your own life of people to whom you might go for advice because of their knowledge, but you wouldn't ask them to help you move. And there are probably people that you might ask to help you fix something, but you certainly wouldn't tell your fears to. And some of you can probably think of people in your life that you think do all of these. And some of you can perhaps look at yourselves and say, I think I do all of these. Okay? And then if we put this in the context of coping with stress, I think perhaps you can see how all of these can be important for folks. Sometimes when we're stressed, we just need the proverbial shoulder to cry on. And in that context, sometimes the support we try to provide is a mismatch with what the person's looking for. I won't ask for a show of hands here, and I don't have a crystal ball, but my guess is those of you that are couples in here, one of you or the other at one time or another have said, I don't want you to fix, I just want you to listen. You've heard that. Okay. And so some of it is, I think in terms of being the one providing support, is really trying to recognize what's needed in this situation. Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of times people have unrealistic expectations of their spouse. Not everybody can be all of those three things at every single point that their partner needs them to be. Life happens. You had a bad day at work, you come home, and you're not as good at giving the emotional support. So, in my opinion, it's unrealistic to expect every single time I need support, he's not maybe going to be able to give that.
Right.
So you have a wide circle of friends and family from which to draw.
Right. And hopefully, as a relationship grows, one of the things you begin to understand is what's this other person good at? And that can sort of be the basis for more realistic expectations. And then getting back to the 5-to-1, if there are lots of arguments because of the lack of instrumental support, you just don't help me do things, maybe taking a different perspective on that is, my significant other doesn't help me do a lot of things, but boy, my significant other is really good at, let's go to the bottom one, at having a knowledge base and being able to think through things clearly. So instead of putting a negative in the column because of frustration that the instrumental support isn't there, have a more realistic expectation, say there's a plus in the positive column because I'm going to celebrate the the informational support that's available.
But what really matters is whether you get all of those three things when you really need them.
Yeah, it's clarity, a match, what's needed in what situation. And sometimes we ourselves, when we're stressed, may not have a clear understanding of which of these we really need. Because sometimes people might be looking for emotional support when, if they just had a little bit of information about something they could do about the stressor, that would actually take care of the problem. So this is a very fluid, dynamic area, I think.
And I think we also need to be able to ask for what we need. Like John said, I don't need you to help me solve this. I just need you to listen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay.
Yeah, and I'm not. If you didn't hear that, she said, we also need to ask for what we need, and that gets back to where we started with the movies. Sometimes our unrealistic expectation is thinking that this other person ought to know what I need here. Well, they're not. Absolutely.
To open your mouth and explain, this is what I'm feeling, and this is what I need. And that's why conflicts happen, because some people don't know what they need. Like you said, sometimes they think they need somebody to just listen, but maybe they need advice more than somebody listening.
Mm-hmm. And so, if, for example, if there are some of those arguments about, I don't want you to fix, I just want you to listen, then preface it. But I want to tell you about a situation. I don't want you to fix. I don't want you to do anything. I just want to tell you about it. I just want you to listen to me. So you create some clarity then. D, on average, is true. Having lots of relationships is better for health. Well, actually, technically D is not true, because having some good relationships tends to be more important. However, typically having a wide social circle is beneficial, in part because then you've got more access to all kinds of support. What are we doing on time here? Let's move on. This is just meant to depict, this is my cue for asking you the question, in a movie, what role does background music play? I'm sorry? It plays tons. What kind of role, though? What does it do?
Sets the tone.
Sets the tone. What do you mean by setting the tone? The emotional tone.
Kind of makes it more immediate or visceral, whatever action is occurring in the plot.
Yeah. And if I ask you, if you think about that first clip that I was showing, what kind of music can you imagine there being if there were a background music to that? And it might depend on which of those perspectives. Yeah. And depending upon the music, had we had music and I played different kinds of music with the same clip, you might have had a different perception of what actually was occurring there. So this is my way of getting into the area of emotional intelligence. I want to talk about emotional intelligence for a few minutes. I realized when I did this bullet point that I'm basically rephrasing what I mean by emotional intelligence, but that's what it means. The intelligent use of emotions. And this is often done or looked at as distinct from IQ, which is intellectual quotient. And in many areas of human life, IQ, our intellect, is a great advantage. And in many realms of life is a great predictor of success. Interestingly, there are some areas, however, where EQ, the emotional quotient, emotional intelligence, is a better predictor of success than IQ. And actually, one of the places where that's been looked at is in the business world with CEOs. CEOs with high EQs often are more effective than CEOs that necessarily have high IQs. So it's all about being able to understand oneself, one's emotions, as well as the emotions of others. and then using that information appropriately. So I'm going to break this down into sort of 4 broad areas, and these areas often are measured when we try to measure EQ. So first of all is perceiving one's own emotions. Being aware of what's going on emotionally with me and with others. Okay? Those of you, again, in relationships can probably think of times, lots of times, where nothing's been said, but it's clear to you that something's going on with the other person. Facial expression changes. Person's less talkative. Okay? So there are lots of ways in which we become perceptive of other people's emotions. And in fact, one of the main ways of measuring EQ, part of the questionnaire involves looking at faces and then linking the expression on the face to some emotion.
This is a bit of an aside, but when you mentioned predicting success for CEOs, it kind of made me think, is emotional intelligence implying someone is also very empathetic as well? Like, because I'm wondering if emotional intelligence can be used to manipulate people. Is it always used for good, or is it just like knowing people so well that you can...
Yeah. And most skills can be used for good or ill, and I would say this can be used for ill as well. I'm guessing there are probably ways in which Hitler had a high EQ. You know, one of the most masterful manipulators, if you will, in history, in known history.
So if you have a high emotional intelligence doesn't imply that you're also empathetic or that you can relate to.
Yeah, right. And we typically think about empathy as being used for good, but not always. Sometimes it could be used to identify somebody who's vulnerable. Ted Bundy, who was a serial killer, if I remember that case right, he defended himself in court. He was so smart. But he also was kind of masterful in relationships and very well liked and so forth. So probably had a relatively high EQ as well, which was part of his way of, getting women in very vulnerable positions. So perceiving emotions, and then having a good understanding of how emotions and thoughts interact. We talked the first time about how negative emotions narrow attention. Kind of being aware of that is part of emotional intelligence. So if I'm able, when I'm upset about something, to have the thought that, okay, I'm so upset that I'm probably not seeing the big picture. Once I calm down, things are probably going to look different. Tomorrow morning, I may be seeing this differently. Again, having those kind of awarenesses, which are sometimes not easy to have when we're upset, but that would be part of emotional intelligence. Understanding emotions. What's going on here? Why am I feeling this way? Sometimes we're kind of uptight, nervous about something. And we may at that point not be fully aware of what's going on. But being able to say in that situation, okay, what's really going on here? What am I responding to? What am I thinking about? Or in communication with others, how will so-and-so feel if I say such and such? What reaction will there likely be if I say such and such? And then hopefully using this information effectively, for good, not for ill. An example of this would be kind of recognizing that when I'm angry, I'm energized, and the purpose of that is problem solving. We talked about that I am worth it acronym, where if I'm not going to engage in problem solving after I look at the situation, then anger no longer has a purpose. But if there is problem solving to take place, then how can I use the energy that comes from anger to act on a problem? When do I need to let go of an emotion? When might I be doing emotional reasoning? In week 1, we talked about some of those problematic thought patterns. Emotional reasoning was one of them. Emotional reasoning would be to assume that my feelings are an accurate reflection of what's actually going on. In that clip, in that second sequence, the guy who was turned and then looked like he was shielding himself. Okay. Now, his reactions would have been immediate, but if he would, if his feeling of, oh, there's a threat here, he may have misread that the threat was this guy coming at him, when indeed the threat was over his head, that it was more of a physical, an accident to happen rather than an assault that was going to happen. A common example might be feeling guilty about something when you're really not responsible for what the situation was. Or another example of emotional reasoning in relationships might be feeling responsible for another person's happiness or unhappiness, when in truth it's that person who's responsible for their own happiness or unhappiness. Now, having said that, part of emotional intelligence also would be that if I've done something that's upset somebody else, then I hope that I'm aware that, I was a stimulus for that other person's distress. Questions about this? Got a couple more things to say about emotional intelligence.
We seem to be in the midst of a lot of offending people, and the other side of that is a lot of people demanding an apology. And I was just wondering about how this demand of apology fits into all of this. It's like, give me a break.
It's almost, sometimes the demand for an apology is sort of like, you owe me something.
Right.
Yeah. And, I think apologies certainly have their place in relationships and so forth, but
they seem to be overvalued.
Sometimes I think they can. Now, having said that, they can also be important in repairing, particularly in close relationships, to just acknowledge I was wrong. And sometimes that can carry a whole lot of weight. And that's sometimes all the other party wants is an acknowledgement. But I would agree, sometimes it becomes more, you owe me this, when that's probably misguided. We periodically have touched on politics a little bit in here. I do think we're in an era in our politics in this country where it seems to be more driven by emotion than reason. Whereas now it's like, if you don't agree with me, then I have nothing to say to you. And from my perspective, that's an emotional kind of thing, and not very emotionally intelligent. So what are the benefits of emotional intelligence? The reason for mentioning it here is people with higher EQs tend to have better relationships. And I don't think that's hard to understand. Better mental health, less substance abuse. I hope I don't offend anybody with this, but one of the most popular programs, if not the most popular programs in school systems to try to reduce kids and adolescents ending up using drugs or alcohol, is the DARE program. And the DARE program, let me say what I think is positive about it. I think it's great sort of public relations, if you will, with safety officers, police, fire, and so forth, who often are involved in these programs. The research of the DARE program suggests that it doesn't really do anything to reduce drug or alcohol use. What does have an effect is what in educational circles, thank you, is what's called social and emotional learning. And basically, it's teaching kids some of these principles of emotional intelligence. Now, it's legitimate to argue whether or not that's the role of school or the parents. Ideally, it's the parents. Okay? But interestingly, school systems that have implemented these kind of things into their curricula also find that kids end up doing better academically as well as socially. So if we want to promote STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, often what will happen is, well, we don't have time for art or other things. We have to focus. But we also often do so at the detriment of actually success in the STEM disciplines, because things like emotional intelligence and actually the kind of brain stimulation that can come from art and music can indeed enhance these, what we would consider perhaps more intellectual endeavors. So fewer behavioral problems in children, better workplace performance, as I mentioned, and more effective leadership. And I think this might be my last slide. How do you practice this? Because our lives don't have background music. You know, when somebody gets home from work, you don't hear music before they come in to let you know what emotional state they're in. You know, so although it's interestingly, some people in abusive relationships, when the abusers, it's getting time for them to arrive at home, the clock itself almost begins to serve as background music. Heart rate goes up, more muscle tension. Okay? So it's almost like background music. But in the absence of background music, we have to use other means to read people's emotions. Because usually we can base that on the music or the language,